We now shine a light into the shadows of global power, examining China's playbook below the threshold. Moderating is Mareike Ohlberg, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Mareike, the stage is yours.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome our two distinguished panelists who will be joining me for this panel. First up is Dr. Anna Krstinovska. She is the president of ESTIMA, which is a think tank in North Macedonia, which focuses on foreign policy and EU integration, and her research is centered on the relations between Southeast Europe, the EU, and China. Welcome. I am also delighted to be joined by Saman Nazari. Sam is an open source intelligent researcher who has built the Pan-European Counter-Disinformation Network, which is a coalition of 65 organizations and over 300 people providing actionable insights for European governments and other actors. Welcome. So I was really happy to see that China is on the agenda here as well. We now have 30 minutes to convince everybody in the audience who isn't convinced yet that this is a topic that is really worth paying attention to. It's a topic that has, I think, gained some attention in recent years, certainly compared to when I first started studying it some 15 years ago, but that's still often elusive in Europe. And that topic is the many ways in which the People's Republic of China tries to influence and shape and interfere in policy in Europe through, be it economic carrots and sticks, elite capture, trying to divide and conquer, information manipulation, or sometimes outright interference. We pay a lot of attention, I think, to what Russia is doing in this space, but so far we have, I think, by comparison, paid much less attention to what China is doing, and we now have the next 29 minutes to change that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let me start with you, Anna, and ask you if you can lay out the scene for us a little bit and explain what are the main levers, channels of influence that China has here in the region, in the Western Balkans, that we should be paying attention to. And as a tag on to that question, if you could also talk a little bit about what changes have you been seeing in recent years in this space?
Let me start by thanking the organizers. It's really a pleasure to be speaking on China in front of such a distinguished audience. And it's really indeed interesting to take a rather longitudinal perspective of what China has been doing in the region. Because arguably the environment in which China operates in the past 5 years or 10 years is constantly changing. And we can describe China's approach as being one of learning, with a very steep learning curve, I have to say, adaptation and resilience. And why am I saying this? Because China in the Western Balkans has arguably become a bit less welcome compared to 5 or 10 years ago. And that, we have to admit, it's largely under the pressure of the US, NATO, and the European Union, who have become aware or more wary of what China is doing and have been transferring these concerns to the region. So it was not a genuine awareness among the region, but most of the governments, and here I would single out Serbia and maybe Republika Srpska as being outliers, but the other governments in the region have become less welcome of Chinese economic projects, infrastructure and investments. However, that has not translated to the grassroots level or the societal level. And this is where China managed to use its adaptation skills to basically change its approach and orient its activities more towards sectors and segments of the society that are not controlled by the governments. Let me start by local authorities. And in democracies, unlike China, they are not directly accountable to the government. So China has been approaching local governments with donations, and they are low-hanging fruit. So with 10,000 euros, you manage to get a twinning city arrangement that basically goes under the radar, and central governments are sometimes not even aware of this. China has been also approaching academia, and universities also have their own freedom and are not always aware of the risks that cooperation with China poses, something that is very topical now in Western and Central and Northern European countries. They have stepped up the work with journalists and media outlets, co-opting journalists through trainings, through media partnerships, even directly putting them on China's payroll. And now with the withdrawal of the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe struggling, we are anticipating an even bigger surge of Chinese attempts to co-opt media outlets. And even we see them directly communicating with civil society, because China until now was not aware of the use of civil society in different countries, but now they have been learning from the playbook, not of Russia, but of Western democratic societies who do engage with civil society to pursue different objectives. So all in all, 5 or 10 years ago, we were talking about China as a state-centered player. Now we see it operating at a very decentralized level, in a very below-the-radar way. So basically, these stakeholder groups are not even encouraged to advertise or talk about their activities with China, but China is using it to shape public attitudes and to also shape the context of policymaking.
Thank you. That gives us a good overview of the full spectrum. You mentioned that China has learned from Western countries and how to reach out to civil society. And of course, an argument that when I talk about this, that I often get as well, America does this, Europe does this, everybody does it, why can't China do it? Now, I want you to talk a little bit about what you see as legitimate channels and illegitimate channels of influence and interference, and where China falls on the spectrum, or rather different activities that China engages in.
I would not label them as legitimate or illegitimate, because from China's perspective, they are legitimate, and the question is also very legitimate. But I think we need to understand that we are not operating in isolation, and we are not an island in the Pacific that has an equidistance with the US and with China, so needs to balance both sides in a rather equal manner. We are in Europe, surrounded by EU member states. We are aspiring to join the EU, all the countries in the Western Balkans. 3 of them are already NATO members. So we have our own geopolitical allegiance, which does not necessarily coincide with China's geopolitical objectives. So these objectives are oftentimes at clash, and we need to be aware of that. That would be the first argument. And the second one is the values. If we aspire to be a part of the liberal, democratic, European family, Euro-Atlantic family, then we want to uphold democratic values, and those are the values that our societies aspire. We certainly have our own shortcomings that we strive to overcome, but it would be completely against these values if we accept what China is proposing, if we accept the vision that China is spreading, for instance, in the UN, on what the internet and freedom of media should look like, if we accept its own version that human rights are not universal, etc. So in terms of values, we should acknowledge that we do not share the same values with China.
Yeah, so basically the approach would be, we're not actor neutral when it comes to this. It matters who is doing this, and we're certainly not value neutral. Now we've done a little bit of a deep dive in the region. I want to flip things around. Sam, you've been working a lot on information manipulation, social media, the kind of disinformation that's being spread there. So I would like to let you have a bit of a deep dive into the disinformation topic, but from a more global perspective. I think you look at various different regions of the world. So I want to ask you, one of the things that I often hear when it comes to foreign information manipulation and interference is that, oh, well, China is quite constructive and they're really just trying to build things, whereas Russia is destructive, causing chaos. So really in this space, we should only be paying attention to China because to Russia. We should only be paying attention to Russia because China is not doing quite as much. What are China's patterns of action when it comes to information manipulation? And what would you say to people who argue that what China is doing is not as relevant as many other actors?
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Thank you to organizers. Yes, China. So as a researcher, I have been working both on China and Russia for the last whole bunch of years. And it's quite clear that while the actors share some similarities, their approaches and their realities are quite different. Looking at Russia like as a threat actor, they are very much in the lamplight. They are under sanction, there is actions being taken against them, and very much due to this, they are acting quite rashly. They're doing quite violent actions. While China doesn't have the same lamplight on them, and because of it, they're acting much slower, but managing to penetrate in a completely different way. Similarly to how in the past Russia was relying on oligarchs and building up people and assets in the long term, now China has been doing so for quite a long time. You were talking about elite capture, and this is also very much what China is doing in relation to their influence operations. They find people that are either journalists, influencers, people who are trying to make a living off the internet, and that are receptive to the ideologies and values that China is publicly, mind you, promoting, and then try to get them into their information space, giving them benefits, giving them visibility, inviting them to travel, giving them a platform and visibility that will benefit these people without directly paying them. Well, now they do sometimes directly pay them, but the crux is in when they do not. And the actions that we have seen is quite interesting when they not only target this very specific, these public figures, but also the people and movements who are more in the background. So actual elites, like actual wealthy people and movements, end up being targeted and end up being brought into the Chinese information space and are being co-opted and used in the campaigns to give legitimacy to the voices of China. To give you two very concrete examples, we have Roy Singham, an American tech entrepreneur who sold his company for, I think, 700 million, 800 million, moved to Shanghai. He's a Maoist, it's always been clear. He knows the founders of Ben and Jerry. He married the leader of Code Pink, which is a big American women's rights movement, and donated tens and tens of millions to different foundations and created a whole bunch of NGOs, media entities, and a wide range of union movements and so on, all around the world. His influence, which has been covered by the New York Times, for example, is very rarely spoken about. And it's just one of the actors that China is using to exert their influence. And what he is likely getting is benefits within China, business opportunities, and in general being given a seat in the discussions within the CCP. We have another movement, the La Roche movement, which is a personality cult almost, who has been also co-opted in a way where they are giving this movement a platform. They're giving them the legitimacy of, for example, creating a Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, by the way, to bring it home a bit, and organizing events with them and things like this, giving them visibility that they otherwise would be hard-pressed to get. And all of these things, in the end of the day, result in these people creating spheres around them, creating their own networks and their own groups of people that they can mobilize to then further China's interests in the information space, but also, as we discussed, also in other sectors. And this, to give you one very concrete example, what this can lead to, when one of these influencers that China had managed to capture was made aware of an article that is highlighting China's discrimination against LGBTQ people, he managed to rally his following to flood this newspaper, this Canadian newspaper, with hate and comments and backlash until this publication removed the article. So it has real consequences. And if you don't know who this guy is, if you don't know how this is working, as a journalist, you're just seeing hundreds of people commenting and saying that you're wrong.
I think that picks up a really important aspect that we don't often talk about when we talk about the information environment, and that's what China is doing in Europe is not just geared towards what narratives, what things, what information to promote, but also what information to suppress, whether that is via harassment, via flooding the inboxes of people, or in some cases doing worse. I do want to follow up, since you mentioned the LaRouche movement, and they have a bit of a connection to Germany. I think the wife is originally German. And one thing that I've looked into them, and one thing that people would tell me when I said China is trying to network with these people is they would say, well, yes, but they're on the political fringe. So what they're doing doesn't really matter. So obviously, I disagree, but I want to ping the question back to you and to ask, what are the patterns that China uses for picking people to work with? And what do you say to the people who would argue that China working with somebody like the LaRouche movement doesn't matter?
I mean, the way they pick these people, at least from what I can see, is based on their susceptibility to their, well, public ideology, like the image that they're spreading about themselves globally. And their willingness and their need of being seen, because they are, as you say, they're fringe groups. They're not being seen in society. And when a major media outlet, for example, like China media group CGTN, ends up approaching them and wanting to do a conference with them and a series with them, asking them to join panels, they feel seen. And all of a sudden, a fringe group that is more or less, falling apart, that more or less is, is incredibly radical, might end up feeling, engaged again, and they might pick up momentum again. And in the end of the day, even if they are small and fringe, they do have a lot of money that they can use to do a lot of different things that is not very much in our interest as European democracies.
Yeah, and in some instances, I guess we've seen the fringe move to the center as well in a lot of countries. So we can't just say something is on the political fringe. We're not going to pay any attention to it. I did have one more question for you, Anna, before we slowly open up for Q&A, and that is, you mentioned that one of the changes you have seen is moving from governments towards broader levels of civil society. What are those patterns? Where would China rather go for the government? Where would it go for civil society? Is there a larger strategy behind that you've been able to identify in any way?
I think we have to emphasize that China is a very pragmatic and opportunistic actor. Mm-hmm. So I do not see any broader Chinese strategy that has been defined in advance for the region, but China has been seizing every possible opportunity to somehow win over the space or any vacuum created in different countries. So if we talk about Serbia, for instance, there the government is very pro-China, but also the population is pro-China due to historic legacies. But it's interesting to see this synergy, how the government has been making the public opinion further pro-China, and that was very visible, for instance, during the pandemic. China was portrayed as the biggest donor to the country, which was not true, by the way, but somehow the government is driving public opinion through its control over media outlets to make public opinion further pro-China, and in turn, this pro-China public opinion is somehow giving legitimacy or enabling further activities of the government with the Chinese, be it investment opportunities, be it the allocation of infrastructure contracts, or even the use of Chinese loans for infrastructure, because Serbia is the only country that has been actively pursuing this path, whereas other countries like Macedonia or Montenegro have already learned the lesson to a certain extent.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have one more question for you as well, Sam, and that is you work a lot on social media as well, and you analyze a lot of the operations on social media. We spend a huge amount of time on social media. Sometimes when I open up my social media, I actually get ads from Chinese actors that are being pushed at me. So what patterns have you noticed on social media that China uses for information manipulation? Anything that we should be particularly aware of?
I think there's two things that's worth highlighting. One thing that everyone keep insisting is completely harmless, and another thing that I think is quite is a very, very powerful tool on top of it, but that people do acknowledge actually. The first thing is China's use of the beautiful China narrative, portraying China as this wonderful, beautiful, amazing, kind country where there is, amazing people that are helping each other, food that is just mind-boggling, and so on. All of these influencers, who are living these cottage lives in the countryside and so on. This is public diplomacy in the end of the day. I mean, every country does it. But what the Chinese are doing is they're kind of trying to greenwash the horrible things that they have done, for example, to the people in Xinjiang, where they have influencers now that are basically, posing as Xinjiang, as Uyghurs, Uyghur minority population, and then trying to, again, launder the image of these people. And by portraying this, China as so beautiful, they manage to capture more and more people, making people curious about China, having them engage with the information, so maybe seeking out travels to China, studies in China, where they might be susceptible to being co-opted and brought into the Chinese information space. I myself studied in China. I did a double degree with the Gothenburg University and Fudan University, and I could clearly see that there were attempts to try to convince us and try to get us to like China and to interact with the professors and so on, and it wasn't. I mean, Fudan was quite good in comparison to many others I've heard about, but it's, still there. And lastly, the influencers. The influencers are a very powerful tool, not just the regular beautiful China ones, but the political ones. There are entire groups of them who are on the payroll of China that are just operating and promoting Chinese interests online, and they are usually not attributed or known, despite being journalists or hired by the state media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, I think, whole troll factories or bot networks, just like with Russia, but paid for by China, that do comment on social media, and it's quite, it's quite a bit. Just for anybody in the audience who doesn't know about Xinjiang, it's basically an ethnic minority region in the northwest of China, where China put huge numbers of people in so-called re-education camps, which were essentially concentration camps, and later fed them into forced labor systems. And in order to cover up for that, they had people travel the region to show how beautiful China is, but of course what they were leaving out was that part. Now I feel like in the past panels we didn't have enough time for audience Q&A, so I want to give our audience a first chance and open up for the first round of questions if there are any. If there are none, we can keep going, but I just want to give people a chance to ask some things. Yes, we have the gentleman over there and the lady in the front, please. And we can maybe pool the two questions and then go into a second round if there's more questions.
So shall I? Okay. I'm curious as to the influencers that you were talking about, predominantly Chinese. Have you structurally seen that they have been spread through around the rest of the world, or these are just in China? And where predominantly?
And I think we take the second question together.
Thank you very much. My name is Alan Musafendic from the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. My question regards the China's strategy when it comes to information manipulation. Do you see any correlation between China's economic activity and investments as they relate to information manipulation? Does it mean there is more or less activity on the psychological warfare front if there's a lot of economic investment? Thank you.
Thank you. You want to start with the question about the influencers, and maybe take the second one, maybe can go to both of you.
Definitely. So actually, there's two sets of Chinese influencers. The ones that are portraying China as being beautiful and living in the countryside and so on. Yes, they're usually Chinese, but a lot of them that are operating in and outside of China are also Western influencers. There is a very famous New Zealander influencer working for Shanghai Daily, who has his own channel and does a whole bunch of different types of contents. And these ones are usually, I would say, more impactful because they're more relatable to Western audiences. And that was it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. They're also, I think I used to track them, and sometimes if you go into certain topics, you can literally find China have influencers from every country. You'll have a Malaysian, Singaporeans, Ugandans, and they often then talk about the same topics.
Yes, one more point to make. A lot of if there's a CGTN or CRI, as it used to be, Channel Radio International station in a country, there used to always also be an influencer attached to them. So Italy, for example, has an influencer that is purely speaking Italian. There's a whole bunch of them across Europe as well. They have their own brands, their own studios, and everything. And for the longest time, they had like 10 views per video, up until a point when they went onto TikTok and all of a sudden exploded in viewership, with the exception of the Italian one, who also was very popular.
You want to take a stab at the... Yeah.
Yes, on the influencers, we do see them quite a lot in the Western Balkans. Maybe we don't label them influencers, because when we say influencer, we usually think of someone who is young and good-looking and doing some advertisement for something that's maybe commercial. But China has gone the extra mile to co-opt quite a lot of influential people. So that's what I would call influencers also in the region. And here you have former politicians or very prominent high-level officials. You have university professors that have a lot of constituents, students, etc. And if we talk about their individual stories, you would see them becoming more interested in China in recent years. You would see them increasingly writing op-eds about China, posting constantly on social media how great China is, that in China there is no corruption, that everything is basically rosy, and that we should be learning from China. And I think that to link it to the next question, they are actually doing the job that China would be doing. Normally, so the Chinese, what we recognize as Chinese outlets and vectors of influence, usually tend to focus on the economic aspects. The biggest strength of China's soft power is the promise of economic opportunity. And that's what they have been using to somehow make themselves more welcome in the country, emphasizing in the region, for instance, look what Serbia got, look how many Chinese investments they got, look how well, for instance, the citizens of Bor are living now with all the Chinese mines being overexploited around them. Now, this was just a joke, but they are selling the narrative that closer ties with China do lead to more economic prosperity.
I would open up to another round of questions, but we are slowly running out of time, and I have one more question for both of you that I would like to ask, and that is, what policies, what tools do European countries need? Do we require, especially smaller countries that have a smaller population, smaller economies, what tools and policies do we need in order to deal with this kind of challenge of relatively subtle but pretty consistent and incredibly well-funded influence and interferences in our societies? Anna, do you want to start?
Yes, I can start with the policy aspect, given that I come from a policy background and have been involved in policy making. the governments in the region, and the governments, I mean all branches of government, not just the executive, but also the parliaments that do have an important role to play, lack the expertise and what you would call in Germany the China competence. So if Germany complains about not having the China competence, you can multiply that by 100 to understand how much the region of the Western Balkans and Southeast Europe more broadly lacks expertise on China. And that is not an expertise that you gain overnight. So if the governments do not have it within, they should probably cooperate with civil society, with academia, so with trusted institutions and organizations to basically develop this expertise in order to be able to understand what China is doing, not just in the region, because a lot of what China is doing in the region is basically a translation or mirroring what China is doing at the global level and mirroring China's domestic objectives. And then there should be also a lot of coordination, because the governments are not always aware what is happening within the country, because China has basically switched to working a lot under the radar. So there should be a lot of coordination, recommendations. Of course, in a democracy, you cannot impose a control over different stakeholder groups, but you can provide recommendations. You can raise awareness about what goals China is pursuing in our own countries. And finally, work more with those partners, allies in NATO and in the European Union who do have the capacity in order to understand how they have been adopting different tools and instruments, be it the foreign direct investment screening mechanism, be it the foreign subsidies regulation, the hybrid toolkit, etc.
Sam, you get the last word. We just ran out of time, so very briefly, what tools, what policies do we need to better combat this?
Looking at how we've been working now as Alliance for Europe on Russia, the key thing that has worked for us as a very small organization, where I am the only researcher, has been to band together with other organizations, civil society, media, academia, fact-checkers, OSINTers, and working together with governments in a true whole-of-society approach, operatively. So actually exchanging, working, analyzing, and going after the threats that we see. And we need long-term funding to be able to do this continuously, especially if we are to be able to understand the threat that comes from China due to the very, very slow and very methodic and very under the radar approach that they usually use.
Yeah, those are all excellent suggestions. We are unfortunately out of time, so please join me in thanking our speakers for their excellent input at this panel.